All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us at 4 o'clock today. My name is Hector Linares. I'm a program manager on the Azure Stack team, focused on business continuity and disaster recovery. That'll be the focus of today's talk. And I've got with me TAP customer Philip Moss from Accutech, Chief Product Officer, and he'll be presenting with me as well. I realize that I'm the last session, I'm in between you and drinks. So we're definitely going to try to wrap up right on time. I'll leave some time for questions, but if we can hold those questions to the end, that'll help me get through the content, and then we can follow up here or as we walk over to the expo hall. So there's 3 areas that I'm going to cover today, and this is really around how we're going to focus on Azure Stack and the journey of Azure Stack in your data center as you start deploying services and modern applications. And it starts really with the journey of understanding how infrastructure gets protected, and then moving on to how you would look at tenant or user applications, whether it's IaaS-based or PaaS-based. And so the 3 areas here really kind of encompass the investments that we're making, either working with partners or developing internally. Now, I think it's going to be important, as some of you have seen from a previous session that I did, to really take a step back and understand really what Azure Stack is in the context of your data center. And for those that have attended other sessions, you know that it's not business as usual when it comes to Azure Stack. So I definitely want to make sure that we keep Azure in mind as we think about operating Azure Stack in the data center, building applications on Azure Stack in your data center, and understanding what does it mean to be highly available, resilient, and what you can do for recovery. There's an operator's role that plays into the recovery piece. It changes pretty dramatically from how you do Hyper-V and VMware today. But you can also invest in how you train or set expectations for your users that are going to be sitting on Azure Stack when it comes to preparing them for the worst case. And obviously, when the worst case happens, we also do have a plan on how to get you back up and running as fast as possible. So if we take a step back before we get on this journey, what I want to do is level set really on how I'm going to approach Azure Stack for this discussion. I'm not going to talk about the internals, the architecture. I'm not going to draw a big box with a bunch of little microservices. That's not really the point. The point is to understand how Azure Stack will operate when you're running multiple regions, trying to run HA, and what does it mean from the infrastructure perspective to come back from a disaster. So from the 2 roles, whether it's user or operator, think about it from this level of the value add in Azure Stack in your data center. And when something bad happens, how do you get this back as fast as possible? This will also serve as the base for everything we do on the tenant side as well, so I'm going to repeat this slide. Okay, so question that we typically get in this conversation is, isn't Azure Stack just a pretty skin on top of Hyper-V and Windows Server and storage and S2D? And really, not even close. For those that have had a chance to deploy the Azure Stack Development Kit or have actually been on the TAP, we've got some TAP customers here, Azure Stack is a complete departure from everything that we know today. The business as usual mindset of backup recovery, disaster recovery, resiliency needs to fundamentally change. And so that will first impact how you approach the infrastructure side of this. So the terminology might stay the same. You'll talk about backup and DR and high availability resiliency, but the context is completely different. So an example of context is thinking about this as an administrator, as an operator. Do you just treat it like a virtualization stack? Is it just Hyper-V? Do I just use the same tools as what you're used to today? The answer is no. Protecting, healing, recovering Azure Stack is a different opportunity, I would say, compared to something like Hyper-V. An opportunity to learn, also an opportunity to understand how you actually do multi-region. In the sense that if you're deploying co-engineered integrated solutions, we're working with all of our OEMs to deploy Azure Stack as an appliance. It's deployed as an appliance, it's operated as an appliance, it's recovered as an appliance. And that appliance experience goes into how you actually use the UI. So for those that have deployed ASDK, there's an administrator portal. You don't get Hyper-V Manager, you don't get failover cluster, you get the new appliance experience. And then from a lockdown perspective, not only in networking, but also security, you don't break into the host the way you would before and install agents, install your tools, all of this changes. So in that context, what happens with a catch-all, what I've heard customers call the catch-all insurance policy? That security blanket that you're going to run in your data center, whether it's Veeam, DPM, Commvault, whatever it is, that just catches all the VMs. It's the backup for all the VMs. In the worst case, what happens when I need to bring things back? So do you have that insurance policy on Azure Stack? The answer is no. Protection of resources and data now actually becomes a user responsibility. And the reason for this is because we're going towards Azure consistency. In the Azure world, especially with modern applications, the onus of understanding resiliency and disaster recovery and redeployment and data consistency across storage accounts really goes up to the application. So if you're looking at something like Azure Stack, it's really important to start with Azure in mind. So what does that mean? First, it's around the strategy. So for BCDR, these practices, again, we're taking a step back, so we're not talking technology yet. It's really about how your business prepares for unforeseen risks, unforeseen impact to continued operations. So that strategy is what you implement, and the implementation of that strategy will drive the technologies. And this is probably the hardest part of the discussion, because if you start from the technologies you have and try to graph it to the strategy, at least for Azure Stack, it's not going to work. How would you protect against downtime in Azure from the application perspective? Because you don't run the infrastructure, right? Do you have multiple fault domains? Do you think about fault domains in that sense? Do you deploy against multiple regions? Do you support active-active? If you do, how do you do data consistency? If you invest in federating applications across clouds, how do you enable that to happen? Do you have the automation necessary, the infrastructure as code, to go and deploy the applications rapidly when there's a disaster? So if you ask yourself, listen, I'm not in Azure yet. This is the reason why I'm deploying Azure Stack. I can't go to Azure. I've got regulatory requirements. I've got data proximity issues. I'm in a country I'm in a company that's not ready to go to the cloud. Does this even apply to me? The answer is absolutely yes. And I'll put this into an example. Azure Stack takes days to weeks to deploy, in the sense that when you buy it, you order it from the OEM, it's got to get shipped from manufacturing, lands into your environment, gets physically installed, and then the software gets deployed by professional services. So that time frame could be weeks, depending on your ordering cycle and everything else. So if you're not ready with another environment, then any SLA that you have for your applications, from a backup perspective, replication, high availability, or fault tolerance, you've just blown that SLA. So if you expect that I can just back up the VMs running the infrastructure, like you would VMM, VMware, vSphere, vCenter, and just run it in another environment and all of a sudden it's managed, that's not the right perspective to come at this. That Azure Stack Cloud has to be deployed and active and running, registered, already on the secondary site in order to enable this. So all of this does apply, even if you're not going to Azure. So let's first start with understanding what happens from the operator's perspective. Let's build from the ground up in this case, from the operator's role in the infrastructure, and then we'll get to the tenant side. So let me start with the demo. So what we've done in Azure Stack is actually built an infrastructure backup controller. This is the thing that goes and grabs some of the data that we need. Now, in order to do that, we actually encrypt the data that we pull out and that we put into a file share. So what I'm starting off with is generating a key. Right now, we have this process. We will have this in the Azure Stack tools eventually. But the idea here is you get a key that you're going to use for the encryption. Once you have that key, you go into the Azure Stack UI. You bring up what's called the Infrastructure Backup Resource Provider, the BRP. And this is where you're going to see all of your backups. So when you first install, you have to configure backup. So the first thing you do is provide a share. In this case, I've got Redmond as my region, and I've got Azure Stack Corp Microsoft as my FQDN. So this is just an external file share somewhere in your data center that is outside of the Azure Stack Cloud, provided a credential, provided a password, and then this is where I use the encryption key. This will enable backup. So this is the first part. Once you've enabled backup, you can then go back in, then you can go back into the settings. Now we don't show the encryption key again, obviously for security reasons. So it is one time into the system, and then we will use that encryption key. All right, that video didn't work. But anyways, I was just going to show the properties. So that's really the infrastructure, start of the infrastructure journey. And really what's happening behind this is that we're actually orchestrating the backup of all the components, pulling out the personality of Azure Stack. To get a little bit more transparent, we're pulling out things like the root certificate created by the CA, we're backing up Active Directory, we're backing up a bunch of other components. And really the complexity of backing that up is why we don't expose it to either partners or to you, because it doesn't make any sense. Or the complexity of the infrastructure is actually something we don't need you to deal with and worry about. So we take care of it. And this really is the seed that we use to recover Azure Stack's personality after catastrophic data loss. So the backup does contain sensitive data, so that's why we encrypt it, so that if it ever leaks outside of that corporate share, the data itself, you'll just have some XML files, but nothing sensitive gets exposed. So really the piece that we're looking at is taking that Azure Stack infrastructure and putting it into an external file share. For GA, it is a manually triggered backup through PowerShell. Each backup is about 10 gigs. They're full backups every time. We're using .NET libraries to encrypt those files, so we're not rolling our own encryption. But keep in mind that this backup does not include switch data, does not include HLH, the hardware lifecycle host, and it doesn't include any of the PaaS value-add services that you install on Azure Stack. That's actually backed up separately. Few pieces on the requirements. So the backup share, like I said, it lives external. We're asking for about 1 terabyte of capacity to hold about 7 days worth of backups. We're recommending about 2 backups a day. Obviously, you can do more depending on the churn in your environment. But 1 terabyte should cover us for 7 days and for future enhancements as we add more capabilities into that backup. We only care about the share that you give us. We manage inside of that share with the data that we put in. So if you give us if you give us a path, hold on a second here. Here we go. So if you give us this path here, no pointer. In the second line, I've got the Contoso FQDN. NYC is my region. So you could have one share for all of your Azure Stack instances. What we really care about is the folder that you give us that's under NYC. Under NYC, MAS backup is what we own, but as a pure folder, HLH, switches, deployment data, registration, all of that you can put in there, but that's something that you would put in there through the scripts for the OEMs or something that you would back up after deployment. So now that you've enabled backup, you would use PowerShell, and this is available through the Azure Stack tools. So you would go to the Azure Stack tools, load up the PowerShell module, and in there, you're going to get a set of commandlets that we use to start backup, to see the backups, to get the backup location. So there's about 5 commandlets that we use in total. Yes?
This is going to be run from what server to what machine? You're going to run this from outside of Azure Stack?
From the HLH would be one. It would have to have access to that environment, yep. So these are the commandlets that are there and available, and so all you would really do is go in, log in with your account as the administrator or the operator of Azure Stack into that environment, and that's when you would be able to initiate the backup. So in this case, I'm logging in. I already got my tenant ID. For those that have had a chance to use the ASDK, this is a typical process on using the Azure Stack tools. Once I'm logged in as a service admin into that environment, I would then, for example, be able to see the backup location. So I can get Azure Stack backup location. That would give me the share. And then from here, I would initiate backup. So that starts the backup. Anything after that, we take care of the rest of the orchestration, all the data that gets put into the external file share. So you can confirm whether the backup was successful or not. So in the BRP, the backup RP will show all the backups as a resource. They're either successful or failed, time to complete, date completed. You can also confirm via an XML file that we put out. In this manifest has all the information around that backup, its status and everything else. So you can get it from both places, either from the BRP through a REST call, through the PowerShell, or if you want to extract it from the XML. So what we do under Mass Backup, which is the folder we manage, we put a date and timestamp, we put a backup GUID, and in there is all the backups that we take. Sorry, the one backup in this case. So manually trigger through in PowerShell REST, 1 terabyte of the capacity. At this point in time, we don't support Azure Files. We plan to support it, just something that we haven't had a chance to test. And our recommendation here is that encryption key, since you're generated separate from Azure Stack, that you need to store it somewhere that you can retrieve it later on outside of the stamp. You can use Azure Key Vault for that, store it as a custom secret, and retrieve it at any time. Some additional considerations. From an ASDK perspective, you can enable backup. You can see the backup, but you cannot use the backup. So we don't support recovery in the Azure Stack and development kit. So right now, Cloud Recovery really only works in a multi-node case. Rotation of the credentials and encryption is up to you. So we don't manage that account. So if the credentials change for the backup, or if the encryption key has to change, that's actually performed by you through the portal or APIs. And in the event that you rotate the key, it is your responsibility to then, if you want to access the previous backups, to actually keep that key around, or to decrypt and encrypt with the new key. So we'll provide guidance in the future on how to do that, but it's really going to be up to you. So when you apply the new key, new backups will be encrypted with that key. Previous backups have to use the previous key. So if you did get compromised and that key did get compromised, you're going to want to, as fast as possible, rotate it on all those previous backups. But you don't have to go back years. You just have to go back for those last 7 days. So like I mentioned, from a switch perspective, the data from the switches, from the HLH, can go onto that share as well, but that's not automated by infrastructure backup. For this, we'll depend on our partners to provide the guidance necessary to get the switch config out, to get the HLH out. So that's the infrastructure, focused on being able to do cloud recovery. Now let's take a step further and talk about the user side. So first, the principle that we've taken here on being able to back up the tenant side is to give you as much backup and protect, is to give you as much flexibility as possible to do that with the tools and products and technologies that you're familiar with today. So what we're announcing is the work that we're doing with all of our partners. We've got 8 partners already in the pipeline that have been working with us on enabling backup in DR scenarios. And I've been able to put most of the landing pages and support pages that they're putting up, and also timelines as to when they're going to have support. Right now, we're going through the process of finishing up scale testing for some of these partners. And so these are the 8. I know there's more. So if your partner is not in this list, if you're the partner that you work with, the ISV that you work with, let me know. We'll get them into the pipeline. And by the pipeline, I mean if they have appliances, if they've got VM offers in the marketplace, if they have extensions, we want to make sure all that is available on Azure Stack as well. And from a flexibility perspective, like I mentioned, that backup or that disaster recovery could be within your data center, could be to a service provider, it could be to Azure. So really it's around enabling, giving you the flexibility to protect the workloads the way you need them protected. We're not going to impose one type of protection or another. So that means, but since you're working really in the guest perspective, you've got all the flexibility to punch out to the internet, go over an express route, VPN to a partner, or stay within your protected environment. What we're also doing as well, we're hosting the first ever Plug Fest for Azure Stack BCDR. And so this is actually happening next week. We've got 5 partners that will be on site with us for the week, doing a bunch of scale testing, perf testing, and this is going to be the base for their reference architecture, support documentation, and everything else that has to come out to make sure that they support Azure Stack the right way. What I want to avoid is a situation where you try this and it doesn't work because the guidance has been provided, and then it sours your taste for Azure Stack or sours your taste for the partner integration. So once you have the flexibility, the tools, the partners, you're figuring out the technologies, what do you do from an IaaS perspective? If you have a bunch of VMs that you're trying to protect. So you start from a protection of in the guest. So this is a significant departure from what we do today in Hyper-V. We are not allowing Hyper-V to get agents installed from any of the partners, including our own DPM. So that means all of the backup context that we're talking about here is in the context of the guest. An agent in the guest, whether it's Linux or Windows, that's backing up on-prem or to a remote location, like a service provider, or even to Azure Backup. So that means you're punching through the northbound interfaces on Azure Stack. You're not going through the infrastructure. So you have the flexibility to use ExpressRoute or VPN tunnels, but it is in the context of those tenants, sorry, the users. Their subscriptions, their networks going up into they're going out of the box. So to reiterate, from an Azure perspective, there's two forms of protection: in the guest or using Azure Platform APIs. We support one half of that story. So we will continue working and add the second half, which is the Platform APIs. What we're not going to do now or later is open up the appliance. So that means things like Hyper-V replicas out, storage replicas out, LUN snapshot and mirroring from the infrastructure perspective is out, even third-party agents. Now, how we enable platform capabilities to do this in the future might leverage some technologies in Hyper-V or Windows, but we're not going to be using capabilities that are available today. I'm actually realizing that this slide should be other types. But anyways, I copy-pasted that wrong. But anyways, Hyper-V, snapshots, and backups, and everything else. So I apologize for that. So I'll fix the slide before you get it, but this should be a backup slide. I had one as well for DR. So what I want to do right now is I want to bring up Philip Moss. He's the Chief Product Officer for Accutech, one of our TAP customers, and really to talk about the DR side of this.
Thanks, Hector. So, as Hector said, I'm Philip Moss. I'm Chief Product Officer at Accutech, and we are a service provider. And that's very interesting because as a service provider for the last 20-odd years, I've been making money and providing services to customers doing infrastructure-level services. So Azure Stack creates some interesting opportunities for us because I could no longer provide infrastructure-based backup and DR services. So we have been able to deliver turnkey managed DR services by leveraging the power of Azure Site Recovery, which we can take as an Azure service, and using that and running it in-guest inside the VMs. Then we are providing a value-add managed experience over the top to give that delivered, integrated managed experience. And this has been a key value opportunity for Accutech because we can drive value on top of that Azure Stack service and experience. Now, let's think about what that experience looks like for our customers. We deploy those customer solutions in as tenants on either our Azure Stack service, inside of our Azure Stack stamps, or inside the stamps they are running on-prem. And the reason that's important is because although I'm a service provider, what I talk about here is just as relevant to the enterprise market. Everything I do as a service provider, you can do as an enterprise sysadmin. Now, so we install those VMs running as a tenant inside the Azure Stamp. And then the customer, the tenant, or your own users, gives us full admin rights into those VMs. Remember, I have to get full admin rights because I have no access from the back end. I have no access from the fabric level. So by gaining that full admin rights, I can then use the Azure Site Recovery agent and I can copy that data out into Azure as part of an integrated DR story. Now, why is that service offering valuable? There are key customer benefits to this approach. Managing and configuring DR solutions is complicated. Figuring out how to make and deliver recovery plans is challenging, and maintaining that replication and maintaining that data integrity is a difficult thing to do. By giving a managed services to my customers or to your internal IT teams, you get that end-to-end experience. And critically, because Azure Stack is 100% Azure consistent, the same size of VMs, the same VM configurations exist within Azure Stack and exist in Azure when the users fail over. So, if I look at this as a summing up, For Acutech, this has been a highly beneficial solution because, of course, we've been able to deliver that fantastic deep customer engagement, both for customers running inside our Azure Stack stamps or for managed customers we run using Azure Stack on-prem. Of course, we've increased revenue. It's a fantastic revenue opportunity. But critically, it drives up that customer stickiness. And for us as a service provider, that's fantastic as we move into this integrated cloud, hybrid cloud integrated world. So hopefully that's informative. Hector, I shall lay back on stage.
All righty. Thank you, Philip.
Thanks, man.
So from a disaster recovery perspective, we're taking a very similar approach. We're basically saying that when you're in the guest, you've got full control of that guest and you have the full flexibility to go on-prem to a service provider or even to Azure. So there's a few things to remember in this context when you're replicating to another environment. If you're in a hybrid connected, obviously ASR is the right approach. But if you're going to deploy two Azure Stack clouds, and you want to have region-to-region failover, obviously Azure Stack doesn't support the concept of regions, but you could be installed in two data centers. Then that data traffic would go through the northbound of the customer, over to the other side, back through the northbound, southbound interfaces. It's always in the context of the tenant. So this is the right slide for this environment. In the replication case or in the DR case, we're not leveraging any technologies under the covers, but we are enabling you to do, just like in Azure, ASR, just like our partners, that enable you to do planned failover, unplanned failover, test failover so that you can actually validate if the failover will work. You can enable reprotection after a failover. All of that would be done either from the volume, disk perspective within the guest, or you're going to use some kind of application replication like SQL has with Always On. So a few considerations from a GA perspective. And this is more of a transparency and kind of a roadmap from a roadmap perspective. Azure Stack does not support the same capabilities in Azure to enable VM level protection. I've talked about in-guest. When we talk about VM level protection, we're using the storage. Azure has capabilities in the storage API layer to take snapshots, to take diffs, to actually be able to take that VM wholesale without bleeding into the guest, regardless of what you're running, and actually replicate it to another environment or back it up to another region. Those capabilities are really around Azure consistency, so that's the second half of the journey for us. And really, we want to align with the protection scenarios that Azure enables. So we're thinking right now from a product perspective, from an engineering perspective, that those types of features and capabilities will not show up, or they'll start showing up in the second half of calendar year 2018. So the reason for the long lead time, so we're looking at 12 to 18 months out, is really because of the engineering effort required to get the entire stack to offer this capability. So you will be, from a planning perspective, I highly recommend that you work with your partners, whether it's Microsoft or with one of our ISV partners, to enable all of these scenarios for your customers today, because that's going to be the protection story that you will have for the foreseeable future. Now, the nice part is that once we have those platform capabilities, the same partners we're working with now are also working with Azure. So they're not going to reinvent the wheel once we have these capabilities in Azure Stack. They will just leverage what they built in Azure on Azure Stack. We have partners today that can point to Azure Public, Azure Germany, Azure China, and enable things like direct restore virtual machines into Azure, into these sovereign clouds. You should think about, in that perspective, Azure Stack as one of those sovereign clouds, backing up between two Azure Stacks or backing up from Azure Stack to Azure from a platform perspective. So this is part of the journey that we're on. I want to make sure I set the expectation that we're 12 to 18 months out from having the storage capabilities that we need in Stack. So right now, it's all about in-guest protection. A few things to consider as well from a deployment perspective. Right now, if you try to co-locate some backup target or some replication target in the same physical network, the top-of-rack switches, where Azure Stack is installed, that is not supported. With the amount of ACLing that we do on the switches and the way that we lock down the flows, there is no way right now that we will support an architecture where you put a backup target on the same physical network as Azure Stack. That could change in the future, but as of right now, that's locked down, and we do not have any mechanism to open that up. From a network topology perspective, I keep mentioning northbound interfaces. Keep that in mind when you're enabling protection for your customers. Obviously, you can use within a VNet, you can have a virtual appliance that takes a backup or replicates. Think about those appliances on stack as an optimization. Whether it's compression or encryption or deduplication, they should just do the work to optimize and then shoot the data out. You don't want long-term retention or even set like 2 days of retention, because if something happens to that stack, that data is gone. So think about those appliances as more optimization than long-term retention. And also you have to think about the VPN tunnel limits, right? So there's the bandwidth limits that you have on VPN tunnels will also impact you from how much data you can push up or push out. So before we get to we leave the IaaS side, are there any questions, any clarifications so far that I can help with? If you want, there's 2 mics here. Feel free to ask any questions, otherwise I'll continue. So from a PaaS side, now we're leaving the traditional IaaS VM world, and we're getting into more of the modern apps, modern applications, object storage, and microservices and containers. And the pattern that we've seen here is that any of the technology that you use today simply won't work. So as an example with PaaS storage, Azure supports something like cool storage. Even though we don't have it in Azure Stack, right, the way that cool storage is done is actually at the object level. Right, so you get to pick and choose from an account perspective what data actually goes to cool, what data goes to archive. So even though they're not supported here, it's something that you need to start thinking about. Because if we do support it, then the same policies you would apply in Azure to migrate your data or to age your data out would have to apply to Azure Stack. We don't support GRS. So in Azure, GRS is that catch-all mechanism, that safety net that Azure offers in the event of a region going unavailable. And so Azure Stack today doesn't support that replication. So if you have applications today that depend on it, that want to use GRS because that's how they get the data to the other side, Azure Stack doesn't support that. So that's something to keep in mind from an application development perspective. If you want to do automated migration of data, let's say from the guest, you could use appliances like StoreSimple. You can NFS, iSCSI out into those appliances, push data that way. And then those can tier up to Azure because it's really done from the application space, not from the storage account perspective. You can also look at manual migration of data with AZ Copy, .NET Library, REST and client and everything else. You could you could roll your own migration story. But really, this comes down to how are you going to protect those applications? Your customers, your users are going to have to think about if they're in an availability set, do they really need a backup agent inside the VM? These are ephemeral VMs that should scale in and out. There's no need to back those up. So what do you have to back up? SQL databases, tables, if they have any kind of websites or functions. Those are the assets that you want to protect, not the infrastructure that runs underneath. Because protecting this will enable you to redeploy, will enable you to put more resilience into your application, separating that from the underlying infrastructure. So this puts us into the mode as well of what happens if you have a CI/CD pipeline. And that's the approach that you want to take or start thinking about as opposed to treating these like just precious applications that can never go down or can't be redeployed. You're going to need to think about how you rapidly deploy them. So this brings us to how does DevOps come into BCDR? And for those that have had opportunities to deploy applications or design applications in Azure or AWS, this is the mindset that now your users are going to have to be in, right? How do they fail fast? How do they quickly redeploy? Can they parameterize their deployments and lift the location, the templates so that they're location agnostic? How do they optimize the utilization of resources so that they're not spinning up hundreds of VMs in every location and just letting them sit there when it comes to testing backup and DR? Do they actually implement resiliency and fault tolerance into the application? Or are they dependent on some other technology? Do they have the ability to validate? How much of this matches to the actual mature processes internally for compliance? And really looking at the modernization and going away from fragile BCDR strategies to more robust strategies that are application specific or drive more application innovation. And the last one is how often do you test this DR? Right, so this is where users are going to from a DevOps perspective on how to actually build for the future. None of this includes the infrastructure. You can't, right? You have to have, if for example, you want to offer application consistency, taking a underlying snapshot of a volume on S2D is not going to give you the ability to have the granularity for application consistency. So what happens when the worst comes? And it's going to, so, right? It's a matter of when, not if. So as an example, let's look at an application that's deployed across multiple clouds. And in this case, this is a customer that's using Azure Stack. The company name is Zenvault. And they're using a technology called Zero Down. Zero Down allows them to put an application in multiple locations. And then with this technology that sits in front of that application, have the ability to have multiple sites that are available and active at the same time. So in this example, what I'm doing is adding a contact. That contact is replicated to all environments. That's the value of Zero Down, is that it gives you active across all, and it's the one taking care of synchronizing the application. In the event that one of those clouds goes down, right, and the application is no longer responding, it is still available in 2 other locations. Those other locations are already synced with the changes that I made. So now that the changes are synced, I haven't lost any data, but now I can worry about getting that first environment back up and running. So I can continue using the application too. So if I add more records, like let's say a pharmacist record, that data can continue to flow into the system and gets registered into the environment. It gets replicated to the available environments. And from there, now you start using some kind of, underneath, it's using logging technology to make sure all those records are kept. So that when the third site is back up, that data can start replicating back. So I've got my contact that's been added. That's across all 3 environments. I'm missing my pharmacist in this case. So now in the background, all of the data now starts getting replicated, logs get played back, and this is how you start enabling a multi-cloud, highly available story in Azure Stack. So not all applications can go down this route, but if you have the application that can do it, this is where you have multiple clouds of Azure Stack as well. It doesn't have to be hybrid. It could be completely within your data center. But you have to start thinking about Azure Stack in these terms of what are the technologies that are going to enable you to keep an application completely available, fault tolerant across multiple clouds. Even if you are in Azure, just because you're in multiple regions, you either have technology that does the multi-region synchronization for you, or you build it directly into the application. So you have an environment that completely went down. Your applications have failed over, you've done recovery, you've failed over applications, you got fault tolerant to the other side, your business is still running. Now what happens to the other side? So it's important to think about cloud recovery in the context of redeploying Azure Stack. So if you have a catastrophe in your data center, a flood, hurricane hits, earthquake, a fire, it doesn't have to be an entire data center gone, it could be a localized fire. You're redeploying that hardware. And this is the SLA I mentioned before. You're not in terms of hours, you're in terms of days to weeks to get that hardware delivered, installed, and software redeployed. So one of the capabilities that we're enabling for Azure Stack is what's called cloud recovery. So once the partner has installed the hardware and deployed the hardware, there's a capability with cloud recovery, you have a choice of actually seeding that personality back into Azure Stack. That's what you enabled before. With infrastructure backup, you get that data back in as part of cloud recovery. So this will give you plans, subscriptions, offers, quotas, and that's going to be the seed in order for you to recover past services, in order to get Key Vault back, and a bunch of other things. Once the partner has finished deployment of Azure Stack in recovery mode, you take over as an administrator, as an operator of Azure Stack. If you had value-add PaaS services, value-add RPs, PaaS services, functions, SQL RP, that's your part now. Another piece that we're enabling as part of cloud recovery is bulk recovery of SQL, RP data, and resources, app services and functions as well. So you can install them fresh and just basically tell customers, redeploy, get your data back in there however you want, spin up a SQL instance, a SQL database, go to SQL Manager, import your data back. That's one approach. Another approach is saying, we will make sure that the databases come back, we'll recreate the database connection, and you can start managing those resources through the RP. If you don't have value-add RPs like app services and SQL, you can skip that step, go to the user side, and say, now, tenants, you can start redeploying your applications, whether it's recovering your VMs or getting the PaaS data back and getting your applications back up and running. So the idea here is that the administrator would be able to log back in, see all of the plans, subscriptions, offers, subscription level RBAC policies. The stamp is using the same deployment ID, so all you got to do is reactivate. You don't have to re-register. From a user perspective, they can just log back into the environment. They're protected, in a sense, from the guardrails that you set up on quotas and plans and offers. They can't exceed that. So just because you're in a cloud recovery perspective, they're not going to get more resources now in the new environment. They will get what they had before. So they can start deploying their VMs, and they're going to be restricted to the limits that you placed in before. Now, it's important to remember that if customers are using Key Vault in Stack and they're rolling their own encryption, you have to do cloud recovery in order to get the CA, the root certificate for the certificate authority, which gets seeded into the RP for Key Vault. That bootstrapping happens as part of deployment, happens as part of the recovery process. But if you don't do this step, that secret can no longer be used again. This is exactly what would happen if I create a Key Vault secret on Stack, export it or back it up, and try to do that in Azure. You will not be able to import that secret just because of the way that it's designed. So cloud recovery in this case actually helps bootstrap all of that back in place. So here's an important decision point, right, as whether it's a fresh deployment of Azure Stack or you're going to do cloud recovery. So I've covered the important steps that come into why you would want to do cloud recovery, whether it's being able to see the environment, the personality, get everything back up and running the way it was before, make sure your subscriptions are there, your plans are there, your tenants are within the boundaries. If you basically just say, you know what, I don't need all of that, I can just do a fresh deployment, that's fine too. So this is an important decision point in your disaster recovery story. So I've got a session that was recorded yesterday that covers this in more detail. Some of you have had a chance to attend that. So it should be up either today or tomorrow, so you can look at that. I've also got a repeat of it tomorrow as well, but I think the recording actually had more time, so that's a good place to start for that. So to wrap up, setting up Azure Stack, setting up your users, getting them on a journey is going to be an important part of understanding how Azure Stack will operate in your data center, in your environment. Understanding if you need 2 environments or 3, two or three clouds, it's going to be important to determine whether you have a good backup recovery story, how you're going to do disaster recovery, whether you're going to use additional technologies for fault tolerance, how you will enable HA, what happens from a networking perspective. Do I punch through to the internet? Do I need an express route? All of those decisions start now. If you start thinking about this after you purchase, after you deploy, you might not size the environment correctly. You might not have all the prerequisites necessary. If you choose to stay on-prem and you're in a disconnected, air-gapped environment, this is where all the partners come in. Backup recovery, disaster recovery, fault tolerance, all of that is capable even if you decide not to go to the cloud. You don't have to go to the cloud for protection. If you choose to use ASR or Azure Backup, that's fine. But you don't have to use them. You can stay completely within your environment, especially if you are in an environment with thin pipes up to the internet, right? Where you have to stay within your country, for example, or within your data centers. So that's the flexibility that you have there. All of that story starts at the user level, the tenant level. Anything underneath from an operator perspective, that's something that we will own from an infrastructure perspective. It's something that you will be able to help your tenants recover from a bulk recovery perspective, but it's always in the context of those tenants. We'll continue working with our partners to automate more of the HLH and switch backup. Right now we don't have it. We'll continue working with them, seeing what makes sense, having all the guidance necessary to say when you should when you should restore versus when you should just redeploy. Over time, we'll close the gap on capabilities that we don't have today, figuring out how we do GRS, understanding do we have cool storage or archive storage. And if you're thinking about this today and saying, I want cool storage in my environment, At some point, you're going to have to think through how much storage capacity do you need in your environment. Today, these are hyper-converged. And if you've seen the amount of capacity available, do you really want to dedicate storage to long-term retention when it's all SSD-based or flash-based? So we will also think through the requirements around bill of materials that enable you to have storage-heavy, cheap and deep storage, versus having very fast storage meant for execution of code and of applications. Over time, we will extend our number of services. So today, app services, SQL functions, we will have a story for them. We have a story for RBAC, we have a story for Key Vault. As we add more services, we have to go through the same process and understand what has to happen for those services to get backed up and properly restored. In some cases, they will be handled by the infrastructure, the cloud recovery. Other cases, you would have to go in and do the recovery with the right instructions. So this is what we have at launch. Like I mentioned, this is a journey. So we're focusing first on in-guest technologies that work at the user level. We will enable capabilities in the future to support Azure consistent technologies and capabilities. These capabilities will align with what the partners are doing as well, so you're not going to reinvent the wheel when it's available. So with that, I want to thank you for your time. I am finishing early. I wanted to give some time for questions, and just so we're not rushed out of here. If you're heading out, thank you for your time. Thank you for being at Ignite. I really appreciate your time here. I will be here available along with Philip for any questions, and thank you very much. If you're going to ask questions, please use the mic. Otherwise, have a great afternoon. Thank you.